On the morning of August 27, 1776, a young officer named Samuel Miles rode hard toward the American lines on Long Island and delivered news that changed the entire shape of the battle in approximately 4 minutes. The British were behind them, not attacking from the front, where 20,000 redcoats had been expected, not pressing through the Gowanus Pass, where American defenders had been waiting since dawn. Behind them, General William Howe had marched 10,000 soldiers through the Jamaica Pass, a gap in the American defensive line that had been left virtually unguarded during the night, and by the time Miles reached his commander, those 10,000 men were already fanning out across the rear of the entire American position on Long Island. The trap was closed. Washington's army, roughly 10,000 men spread across the heights above Brooklyn, was surrounded on 3 sides. The ocean was at their backs, the British to their front, their flanks, and now their rear.
What happened in the next 4 hours should have ended the American Revolution before it had properly begun. The British had the numbers, the position, the professional training, and the momentum of a perfectly executed flanking maneuver. They had everything they needed to destroy Washington's army in detail and end the rebellion on a Tuesday morning in late August. What they did not have, in the critical 40 minutes that decided the difference between annihilation and escape, was the ability to get past a road junction at a place called Gowanus Creek. And the reason they could not get past it was 400 men from Maryland who made a decision that every military historian who has studied that morning agrees should not have worked, could not have worked, and somehow, at an almost unbearable cost, worked anyway. Their names were not written large in the history that followed. Washington got the monuments. The Maryland 400 got a historical marker and a disputed burial site in a Brooklyn neighborhood that most people drive through without knowing what happened there. This is their story.
The setup, how everything went wrong before breakfast. To understand what the Maryland soldiers did and why it mattered, you have to understand how completely the American position had collapsed by the time they were needed. The defense of Long Island had seemed, on paper, manageable. Washington knew Howe's army was coming. He knew roughly where they would land. He had positioned forces across the heights above Brooklyn along a wooded ridgeline called the Heights of Guan, with the intention of holding the high ground and making any British advance costly. The defensive line ran for several miles, anchored on the right by the water at Gowanus Bay and extending east through 3 key passes: the Gowanus Pass, the Flatbush Pass, and the Bedford Pass. The problem was the Jamaica Pass. East of the Bedford Pass, the ridgeline continued and then bent north toward Jamaica, and through that bend ran a road that, if used, put an attacking force directly behind the entire American defensive line. Washington had been warned about the Jamaica Pass. His commanders had discussed it, and then they had assigned 5 militia cavalrymen to watch it overnight. 5 men to guard the back door to the entire Long Island position. General Howe had not achieved his military reputation by overlooking unlocked back doors. On the night of August 26th, he sent a diversionary force toward the Gowanus and Flatbush passes to keep the American attention fixed forward, while 10,000 of his best troops, the elite light infantry, the grenadiers, the guards, marched in darkness and silence toward Jamaica. The 5 militia cavalrymen at the Jamaica Pass were captured without raising an alarm. By 4 in the morning, Howe's flanking force was through the pass and moving fast. At dawn, they fired 2 signal guns that told the British diversionary forces in front to begin their advance in earnest. The American commanders on the heights of Guan heard those 2 guns and did not immediately understand what they meant. By the time they did, the flanking force was emerging in their rear, and the diversionary force was pressing hard from their front. The American defensive position did not collapse, it disintegrated. Regiments that had been in position all night found themselves suddenly attacked from 2 directions simultaneously, their retreat routes cut,
their coordination with neighboring units severed by the speed of the British advance. Men who had been told to hold the passes were now simply running, individually and in small groups, trying to get back to the main American lines on Brooklyn Heights before the British closed the last gaps. Most of them made it, many of them did not. And the British pursuit was fast, professional, and extremely effective at turning a retreat into a rout.
The ground at Gowanus.
Between the collapsing American forward positions and the main defensive lines at Brooklyn Heights lay a salt marsh called Gowanus Creek. In August 1776, the creek was not an obstacle that men with a head start could simply wade through. It was 40 feet wide in places, tidal, with soft mud bottoms that could swallow a man to his waist, and surrounded by marsh that channeled anyone crossing it toward a single stone mill dam at the northern end. That crossing point, the mill dam at the old Vecti Cortelyou house at the south end of present-day Brooklyn, became the choke point through which most of Washington's retreating soldiers had to pass to reach safety. If the British got to that crossing before the retreating Americans did, the entire force between the heights of Guan and Brooklyn Heights was trapped. Lord Cornwallis had understood this. He had pushed a column of British regulars fast toward Gowanus Creek, cutting across the retreat route with the intention of getting to the mill crossing ahead of the Americans and sealing the trap completely. At approximately 9 in the morning, Cornwallis's force had nearly done it. They were at the old stone house, the Cortelyou house, or approaching it from one side, while streams of retreating Americans were trying to reach it from the other. A few more minutes, a slight acceleration in the British advance, and the crossing was blocked. What stopped them was a regiment of Marylanders.
The 400, the 1st Maryland Regiment in August 1776, was, by any fair assessment, one of the finest units the Continental Army had yet produced. It was composed largely of volunteers from the more prosperous families of Maryland, men who had some means, some education, and, critically, some time to train before the war found them. They had been drilling since the spring. Their officers were competent. Their equipment was, by the standards of the Continental Army in 1776, unusually complete. They were commanded that morning by Major Mordecai Gist, 28 years old, a Baltimore merchant who had helped form the regiment and drilled it through the spring and summer. Gist was not a professional soldier by background, but he had the quality that matters most in the kind of situation he was about to face. He did not panic, and he did not freeze. The Maryland Regiment, roughly 400 men, had been positioned in front of the old stone house and the Gowanus Creek crossing as part of the rear guard of the American left flank. When the collapse came and the retreat began, they were among the last units still in organized formation, covering the retreat of the men streaming past them toward the creek.
General William Alexander, the American commander on that flank who went by the title Lord Stirling, despite the British government's refusal to recognize his claim to a Scottish earldom, assessed the situation with the clarity of a man who understands exactly what he is looking at. Cornwallis was coming. The retreat route would be cut in minutes. Someone had to buy time. He looked at his Marylanders. The order he gave them was to attack Cornwallis's advancing column. Not hold position, not delay. Attack. With 400 men against a British force that numbered in the thousands, supported by artillery on open ground, Stirling himself would lead the first charge.
5 charges before noon. What the Maryland 400 did between approximately 9 and 10:30 in the morning of August 27, 1776, was charge the British position at the old stone house 5 times. Not once, 5 times. The first charge went in with Stirling himself at the front. The Marylanders crossed the open ground south of the stone house and hit the British defenders in a rush that briefly pushed the Redcoats back from the building. For a few minutes, the attack had momentum. British troops who had not expected to be charged, who had expected to be chasing a rout, were thrown onto the defensive. Then British reinforcements came up. The Marylanders were pushed back. They reformed and charged again.
The second charge was bloodier than the first. British artillery was finding its range. The British infantry, recovered from the initial shock, were forming proper firing lines. The open ground between the American position and the stone house was becoming lethal to cross. The Marylanders crossed it again anyway.
Each charge bought minutes. Each charge cost men. The retreating Americans behind them, the soldiers from the shattered regiments who had been running since the flanking force appeared at their backs, were using those minutes to cross the mill dam and reach the Brooklyn Heights lines. Each minute the Maryland regiment stayed in the fight in front of the stone house was a minute that someone else's soldiers were making it across Gowanus Creek. The third charge broke further on British fire. The fourth was mounted by fewer men than the third. By the time Gist led the fifth charge forward, the regiment had taken casualties that would have justified any commander in ordering a retreat an hour earlier. They went forward anyway. Washington watched the fighting from the Brooklyn Heights above. He had his telescope on the Marylanders, could see what they were doing and what it was costing them, and the account that has come down through multiple witnesses describes him gripping a fence rail, watching charge after charge go forward into British fire and saying, "Good God, what brave fellows I must this day lose." He was watching men die to save an army. He understood exactly what was happening and exactly what it was worth, and he could do nothing except watch. The math of the sacrifice. Here is the number that defines the morning. The 1st Maryland Regiment went into the fighting at Gowanus Creek with approximately 400 men. When it was over, when the surviving Marylanders finally broke contact and made their own desperate attempt to cross the creek, swimming through the tidal marsh under fire, 256 of them did not come back. Not wounded and evacuated, not captured to be exchanged later, dead or captured to spend the remainder of the war in British prison ships in New York Harbor, where the conditions were so brutal that more Americans died in those floating prisons than died in combat in the entire Revolutionary War. Gist got back. Sterling did not. He was captured trying to cross the marsh and spent several months as a prisoner before being exchanged. Of the roughly 400 who had gone forward, perhaps 150 made it back to the American lines. Those are losses that by any formal military standard represented the destruction of the unit. More than half the regiment was gone in under 2 hours. What they had purchased with those 256 men was the survival of perhaps 3,000 to 4,000 American soldiers who crossed a mill dam at Gowanus Creek while the Maryland 400 were dying in front of the stone house. Soldiers who would survive to fight at Trenton, at Princeton, at Brandywine, at Germantown, at Valley Forge, at Yorktown. The arithmetic is brutal and clear. Roughly 1 Maryland soldier died or was captured for every 12 to 15 soldiers who made it across that creek. No historian has ever seriously argued that the majority of those soldiers would have gotten across without what the Marylanders did. Cornwallis was minutes from the crossing. A few more minutes without someone stopping him and the creek was closed, and 3,000 or 4,000 Americans were trapped between the British forces closing in from every direction. The Maryland 400 were the door that held long enough for the rest to get through. Then the door came off its hinges, but by then the ones who needed to be through it were through it. What Howe did next? The Battle of Brooklyn was an overwhelming British victory. Washington's army lost somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 men killed, wounded, or captured on August 27th. The British lost fewer than 400. The heights of Guam were in British hands. The remains of Washington's army were compressed onto Brooklyn Heights with the East River at their backs. Howe had them. He chose not to press the attack. The decision Howe made on the evening of August 27th is one of the most analyzed and argued over command decisions of the entire war. He ordered a formal siege approach instead of an immediate assault on the Brooklyn Heights position. His reasoning, articulated in his dispatches, was that a direct assault on prepared defensive positions would cost more British casualties than a methodical siege,
and that the Americans were already trapped and could not escape. He was wrong about the last part. Washington spent August 27th, 28th, and 29th organizing the evacuation of his army across the East River to Manhattan. On the night of August 29th, he loaded every man, every horse, every cannon, and every supply wagon onto boats and crossed the river in darkness and fog.
The same Colonel John Glover, whose Massachusetts fishermen would later conduct Washington's army across the Delaware on Christmas night, ran the East River evacuation. The same fog that would prove decisive in multiple Revolutionary War engagements rolled in at exactly the right moment on the night of the 29th, extending the window of darkness long enough for the last boats to cross before British sentries on the shore understood what was happening. Washington got away with approximately 9,000 men. The argument about whether Howe made an enormous strategic error has occupied historians for 2.5 centuries, and it has never been definitively resolved. Howe's defenders point out that an immediate assault on Brooklyn Heights on the evening of August 27th would have been costly and uncertain. His critics point out that destroying Washington's main army that evening before the evacuation would almost certainly have ended the war. What nobody argues is this. By the time Howe made his decision on the evening of August 27th, the window that the Maryland 400 had created was already closed. The men who crossed Gowanus Creek at the mill dam were already on Brooklyn Heights. They were already in the boats when the fog came in. They were already in Manhattan by the time the British discovered the position abandoned. The Marylanders died on a Tuesday morning. The army they saved crossed to Manhattan on a Thursday night.
Why nobody talks about this? Here is the frustrating historical reality. The Maryland 400 are not well known. Outside of Maryland, where the state takes a reasonable pride in what its soldiers did that morning, the engagement at Gowanus Creek is not part of the standard popular narrative of the Revolution. The reasons are structural and somewhat predictable. The Battle of Brooklyn was a defeat. American popular history is considerably more comfortable with victories, and the story of August 27, 1776 is fundamentally a story about a catastrophic tactical failure, the unguarded Jamaica Pass, that was partially rescued by extraordinary sacrifice. The rescue is heroic. The catastrophe that required it is uncomfortable. Both together make for a complicated narrative that is harder to celebrate cleanly than Trenton or Yorktown. There is also the problem of what happened next. Washington's evacuation across the East River is genuinely extraordinary. The fog, the timing, the silence of 9,000 men boarding boats without the British discovering them, and it tends to absorb the available attention for the August 27th to 29th sequence. The evacuation has drama and surprise and a successful outcome. It is easier to tell as a story.
The Maryland 400 story is simpler and harder. They were given an impossible assignment. They carried it out past the point where any reasonable person would have broken off. They paid an enormous price. They made it possible for other people to survive. And then history moved on to the next crisis and the next battle, and the people who made survival possible slipped into the background. This is a common trajectory for rearguard actions and sacrificial engagements throughout military history. The men who covered the retreat are rarely the men the monuments go up for. The monuments go up for the men who won the battles the survivors of the retreat eventually fought. The connection between the sacrifice and the victory it enabled is real, but diffuse. It happened months or years later by different men in different places, and the thread back to the Marylanders at Gowanus Creek requires a level of historical attention that popular narrative rarely sustains.
The Old Stone House, today. The Cortelyou House, the old stone house at Gowanus, was demolished in the 19th century. A reconstruction was built in the 1930s using original materials recovered from the site during excavations, and it stands today in J.J. Byrne Park in the Park Slope neighborhood of Brooklyn. You can walk to it on a Tuesday morning, which is exactly the day of the week the battle happened, and it is surrounded by a playground and a dog run and the ordinary comfortable noise of a Brooklyn neighborhood in 2024. From the front of the house, looking south, you can see the approximate line across which 400 Marylanders charged 5 times into British fire. The ground is flat. The distance from the house to where the American lines would have been is not large. On a quiet morning with the kids at school and the dog owners gone, you can stand there and think about what it would have looked like with artillery firing and 400 men coming across that open ground for the 5th time. It does not look like a place where history was made. It looks like a park in Brooklyn. But history is made in ordinary places by people who were not planning to make it. The Marylanders who formed up that morning did not know they would be remembered, and largely have not been. They knew they were being asked to do something that would probably kill most of them. They did it anyway, 5 times, because the Army needed the time, and they were the ones standing there. Across the creek, Washington watched them from the heights and knew exactly what he was seeing. He knew the value of what they were spending and what it was buying. He knew he could not save them, and he watched them go forward into British fire again and again, with an understanding of military sacrifice that no general who has ever sent men to die has described better than he did in those 6 words from the heights above Gowanus. Good God, what brave fellows I must this day lose. He lost them. The Army lived. The Army lived, retreated to Manhattan, crossed the Delaware on Christmas night, won at Trenton, survived Valley Forge, fought at Yorktown, and became the foundation of a country that exists today. The thread from the country to that morning in Brooklyn runs through a mill dam over a salt marsh creek that most people in the neighborhood have never heard of, held open for 40 minutes by 400 men from Maryland who were asked to do something impossible and did it anyway. They did not win the battle. They did not win the day. They lost the ground, most of their regiment, and their commander to a British prison ship. What they won was time, 40 minutes of time, and 40 minutes on August 27, 1776, turned out to be exactly what the American Revolution needed to survive. The lesson that doesn't fit neatly. Military historians study Rorke's Drift and Thermopylae and the Alamo for the same general reason they study the Maryland 400. Because these engagements reveal something about human capability under pressure that broader campaign histories obscure. The larger picture of the Battle of Brooklyn is about Howe's genius at the Jamaica Pass, about Washington's catastrophic intelligence failure in leaving it unguarded, about the structural weaknesses of an army trying to defend a long line with untrained militia. These are legitimate and important lessons about command and planning and the cost of defensive overstretch. But those lessons exist at the level of generals and staff officers and campaign plans. The lesson at Gowanus Creek exists at a different level. It is a lesson about what individual soldiers and junior officers do when the plan has already failed, when the battle is already lost, when the only remaining question is whether their sacrifice can buy enough time for someone else to escape. Chard and Bromhead at Rorke's Drift made a choice to stay and fight and turned 150 men into a fortress that held for 12 hours. Washington at Trenton made a choice to cross a frozen river and turned desperate retreat into sudden attack. Mordecai Gist and Lord Stirling made a different kind of choice. They looked at what they were being asked to do: attack a superior British force on open ground 5 times until the men who needed to escape had escaped, and they did not search for a better option because there was no better option. They made the only choice that gave the army a chance, and they paid for it in full. The lesson does not fit neatly into a framework about tactical genius or strategic vision. It is simpler and harder than that. Sometimes the right decision is the one that saves others at the cost of yourself. Sometimes the door that needs to stay open can only stay open if someone stands in it and holds it against everything that is coming through. The Maryland 400 stood in that door on a Tuesday morning in August 1776. They held it long enough. The country on the other side of the creek is the proof.